The early novel. Of all the extraordinary evolutions of British literature in the 18th century, the most remarkable, the most memorable, was the rise of a new literary genre, the novel. A genre that was born almost out of nothing, apparently, alongside with the emergence of a new social class, the bourgeoisie. The novel was to change, to take various shapes, to adapt to the tastes of an evolving audience. The novel was there to stay. The novel remains today the most beloved, the most widely enjoyed literary genre. Its vitality kept it from sinking like other literary genres did. We will be taking a look at the possible definitions of the novel, at its characteristics, and then we'll focus on a number of evolutions in the social life of the 18th century, in religion, in the technology of printing, but then also in the evolutions of other literary genres, but also in the development of non-literary, non-fiction writing practices, which, if we look now in retrospect, we realize that in a way or another, they were to prepare the birth of the novel. The birth of memorable books like Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, Gulliver's Travels by Swift, then Pamela by Samuel Richardson, Tom Jones by Fielding, Gothic novels like The Castle of Otranto by Walpole, and the novel of Jane Austen such as Pride and Prejudice. Let's first take a look at possible definitions of the novel. So obviously it's a work in prose. It's epic. It has a certain length, usually over 100 pages. It presents a fictional world that has similarities to our real empirical world, has a number of characters, and usually those characters are complex enough and they are involved in a plot of a certain complexity. So all of these are rather empirical things, empirical words, empirical observations that could lead us to a fairly good working definition of the novel. It's also true that if you look at some more recent novels, you may see that pretty much almost every point in this definition can be knocked down, can be dismissed. There are novels which were written in verse. There are novels which have a strong lyrical flair. There are also very short novels, some of them maybe even running beneath the limit of 100 pages. There are novels in which the number of characters is minimal, and interestingly, even the first novel ever, Robinson Crusoe, has one, or if you wish, two characters. So all of these things do not indicate that the novel is impossible to define. All of these show that the novel was able to move at a great distance from its original definitions. Now, let's look at non-literary elements that prepared the rise of the novel. So here we'll be taking a look at some evolutions in society, in the system of beliefs of that society, in technology, that were responsible with creating an atmosphere in which the novel became necessary. Probably the most important is the rise of the new class, the bourgeoisie. A new class which was independent, which lacked a noble ascendancy. It was self-made. The bourgeoisie was almost like an orphan class. It did not have any rich parents. It didn't have any traditions. And yet the bourgeoisie felt that their stories of self-made men, stories of success, stories of hard work, needed be told, needed be shared to the world, even if they apparently weren't heroic in the old sense of the term. A second one, the Protestant ethic. The Protestant church, which, as you probably know, doesn't have the practice of confession, invited its believers to have moments of self-contemplation, moments of self-reflection. And those moments could result in persons sitting at their desk and writing down confessions, autobiographies. So this practice of reflective confession in writing might have been responsible with a number of fictional and non-fictional writings at the time. There is also in the Protestant ethic a certain sense of both community, I would say, but also of individuality. The person is responsible for his or her deeds, for his or her success. And again, that seemed to encourage the attention given to individuals in prose. The development of the movable type printing presses is also very important. Remember that in the Middle Ages, all books were handwritten by those scribes. They took a long time to be copied down by hand. It was very difficult to multiply them, since all this was such a painful, lengthy process. Then, when printing was invented, you have to remember that the first books which were printed using plates which were individually produced. That meant that every page was carved onto a matrix, and once used for the printing of the book, it had to be destroyed. So all the lead had to be melted and reused. When Gutenberg invented the so-called movable type, this was a revolution, because now they were operating with tiny bits of lead, each of them a letter, which were hand-picked and hand-laid out one after the other in a text. The moment the book had been printed, all of those types could be taken out and they were easily reused. And then, as a result of this new machinery, the cost of production of the books went down, and then books' prices obviously went down, and more people were able to afford books. Not just the rich, not just the priests, the clerics, but also common people, middle-class people, men and women. Moving on, there was also an increased literacy. More people than before were taught how to read and write in the new public schools. And then, let's also say that people became more interested in other people's stories. A curiosity that has to do with the, let's say, open nature of this new class, the bourgeoisie. Then there was more spare time allotted to reading long books other than the Bible or almanacs. So there are also evolutions in the practices related to writing, literary elements that prepare the rise of the novel. And let's have a look first at fiction. We will begin by looking at the literary elements that prepared the rise of the novel. What exactly happened in the 150 years before the first novel appeared, which in a way or another prepared this very important moment? So we look at fiction, the opposition to the literature of the Romance. The Romance is a literary genre which dominated the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and it was generally the story of high-born aristocratic characters engaged in acts of religious devotion, of love, and boldness in combat. We have three types of romances. The chivalry romance, as the one illustrated by this picture, in which you generally have a knight going on a crusade, leaving behind a beloved, and it's a story of valiance in combat and loyalty in love. Then there is also the court romance, which deals with intrigues at the court. And then also the so-called pastoral romance, which is the story of a love between a shepherd and a shepherdess, completely unrealistic. It's an idyllic story happening in a bucolic rural landscape. Now, all of these romances started looking increasingly out of time, out of touch with the emergent new class of the bourgeoisie, the middle class. They felt that they had nothing to do with those medieval stories, and they started hankering, yearning for something new. And now you have that. The pastoral breaks apart, the chivalry romance is rejected. And it is rejected primarily by a major work of art, Don Quixote de la Mancha, a narrative published by the Spanish author Miguel de Cervantes in Spain in 1615. We are 100 years before Robinson, and the Spaniards still to this day, they claim that Cervantes is the first novelist ever. In this course, we will be defending the idea that, however, the first novel ever is Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, published, as you know, in England in 1719. Why is this story so important? Because it's the story of an intoxication. Don Quixote, an avid reader of chivalry romance, is completely intoxicated by his ingestion of such unrealistic literature, and he sets out on an adventure, on a chivalry quest, alongside with his page Sancho Panza. But this is an adventure which is doomed to perish because he mistakes reality with the figments of his literature-fed imagination. And this is the famous moment when he attacks a huge windmill that he mistakes for some giants. There is another type of literature that opposes this type of literature, and this is the Picaresque Novella. We can't call this a novel yet, but it's a narrative that gets pretty close to the novel. And again, we have to go to Spain and to look at the so-called El Pícaro. El Pícaro is a highly problematic human type. You would translate this in English as the rogue, which is not really a villain. It's a character that might be likable, enjoyable, sympathetic, but who is usually of low birth, doesn't have a home, doesn't have a country, doesn't have loyalties, and he just fights his way through cheating, swindling, playing tricks on other people. He's a fraud, he's a trickster, and yes, he seduces women again to get his pleasure. The Picaresque Novella appeared in Spain about the same time, and it's best represented by the life of Lazarillo de Tormes and his fortunes and adversities, an anonymous story which was first published in Spain in 1554. It's a story that consists of several sequences. It has an episodic structure. It would resemble those TV series in which the story doesn't add up from one series to the other, from one season to the other. In England, this genre was emulated, was copied by several authors. The most important would be Thomas Nash with The Unfortunate Traveller, a Picaresque novella published in 1594. It's a story of Jack Wilton. It takes place under the reign of Henry VIII, and it begins in France with a character that then travels to Germany. He takes part in several religious conflicts, including the massacre of the Anabaptists, a good occasion for the author to denounce religious hypocrisy. Then he travels to England and then to Italy in order to defend the honor of a lady. Another journey takes him to Rotterdam in Holland, where he meets the great humanist Erasmus and Sir Thomas More. Then he travels to Italy, in which he has to swap identities with his companion. He ends up in prison for fraud and he's released upon the intervention of the Italian satirist Piero Aretino. He travels to Venice, Florence, Rome, and all along he's in the search of his beloved Diamante, his beautiful lady of the heart. Eventually they meet, they are wed, and they return back to the English camp in France. How did the Picaresque Novella influence the birth of the novel? By its suspenseful narrative, by its swift change of planes, by its low-class environment. Is there any disadvantage to this? Yes, the episodic narrative and the fact that the character never really changes. Moving on, the prose of the characters. The prose of the characters is a very old type of literature. It's a type of literature with a moral goal, and the earliest characters were portraits of vices and virtues, as exemplified by certain types. And here's some of the masters of the prose of the characters. We begin with Greece, the characters. Theophrastus wrote 2 volumes, one devoted to the vices, one to the virtues. One is lost, guess which. This tradition was pursued in England by Joseph Hall, the author of Characters and Virtues and Vices, in 1608, then by Thomas Overbury with Characters or Witty Descriptions, and then by John Earle with Microcosmography of 1628. The more we advance in time, the more historicized these portraits become, the less abstract, the more individualized. So in some of these later books, we have portraits of bourgeois, we have portraits of people who are crazy because they are in love, we have portraits of children described as notebooks on which life hasn't scribbled anything yet, and so on and so forth. This is the generic image of a miser, a penny pincher, a person who loves gold more than people. Death awaits this person around the corner. Money, possessions, material possessions are useless. From these types, prototypes, archetypes, we move on towards individuals. Portraits of individuals embedded in historical time, embedded in social class, like this image here, in which you see an usurer, a moneylender. And if you look at the person's dress and at the woman's gown and at the furniture here, you realize this is set in a middle class environment. This is what happened, therefore, in the Prose of the Characters, moving from archetypes to individuals. And if we are to discuss what is the contribution that the Prose of the Characters had to the development of the novel, we should say it's the fact that it helped the novel move towards the portrayal of individuals. Then, satire and pamphlet. A next influence, satire and pamphlet. Satire, as you know, is a humorous genre that criticizes reality. And pamphlet, as we will see in another lesson, is just a form of distributing the satire in a loose sheet brochure form. England has a rich tradition of satire. And if we look back in time, we see people like Thomas Lodge with Narrative Against Usurers in 1587, then Thomas Nash, Piers Penniless and his Supplication to the Devil from 1592. And then we have Robert Greene with Connie Catching, 1592, so rabbit catching. This is actually a code word in the thieves' jargon, in the criminal jargon, referring to burglary, to thieving, as you can see in this image of a rabbit which is about to burglar into a house. And then also Thomas Dekker, The Girl's Hornbook of 1600. We move on to dream allegory. Dream allegory was very popular in religious writing. As the name and this picture suggest, this is a narrative in which a character falls asleep and has a dream, a vision. That vision is usually a religious one. He learns or she learns about a prophecy or a mission he's sent on. The dream allegory was very popular in the 1600s. And the most popular of these was the work of John Bunyan. John Bunyan himself is a very strange, very unusual character. He was a member of the Protestant group, the Bedford Meeting, a nonconformist group which was harassed, which was oppressed by the government. As a result, John Bunyan became a victim of the law of uniformity, which claimed that the only version of the Bible to be used is King James Bible, and of the Licensing Act, which banned any preacher that didn't have a license from the government. As a result, he spent 12 years in jail, where he wrote a spiritual autobiography called Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. But his most important contribution to literature was this, The Pilgrim's Progress, published in 1678, which is a story set in this format of the dream allegory. This is a highly symbolic parable. A man called Christian has a dream, and he learns that he has to move away from the city of destruction, capital C, capital D, to the celestial city, which is indicating the way of the non-believer to conversion and to full religious belief. He travels across a highly symbolical geography. He crosses the valley of the shadow of death. He crosses the slough of despond, that would mean the swamp of despair, or even Vanity Fair, which, by the way, is not just a women's magazine, or it's not just a novel by William Makepeace Thackeray. Initially, it was this place in which anything could be bought, including virtue, including honor, anything. Of course, Christian's arrival at the celestial city is synonymous with religious salvation. The lesson that dream allegory had to the novel was that life incidents shape our characters and that people evolve, people change. And the side lesson, I would add, would be the acceptance of the power of imagination and fantasy. The English essay is another great contributor to the novel. The English dispute with the French the invention of the essay. The essay actually is a French word, essai. It would mean attempt, trial, something unfinished. As we will have a separate lesson on the essay, I'm just gonna mention some names here. Richard Burton, the English author of The Anatomy of Melancholy of 1621, or Isaac Walton, the author of The Complete Angler, The Complete Fisherman, published in 1653, and then Thomas Browne, The Garden of Cyrus of 1736. The essay allowed free-flowing thought. The essay allowed free association of ideas, a non-systematic treatment of the material. And this was to prove important for the novel, because initially the novel was disregarded as a popular genre, lacking intellectual depth. And the second generation of novelists attempted to grant the novel exactly this quality, intellectual value, intellectual depth, by engaging in intellectual debates, in discussions about history, society, religion, or the arts. And then we should also mention the Jacobean comedy of manners. After the great age of Shakespeare, the English theatre suffered. Its universal appeal declined. However, even if it lacked Shakespeare's grandeur and drama and symbolism, the Jacobean comedy of manners criticized the mores of the time and was able to become very popular with the public. William Wycherley, The Country Life, is a good representative of this, 1675, and then Congreve, William Congreve, The Way of the World, 1700. The English proto-novel of the struggling craftsman is another great contribution to the advancement towards the novel. Its main representative would be Thomas Delaunay. Thomas Delaunay wrote a series of narratives which cannot be properly called novels because they still lack some of the characteristics of a good novel. They are generally a bit simplistic and they lack the subtlety or the complexity of the plot. Two of his titles, Jacob Newbury, 1597, and The General Craft, 1597. Both of them are rise stories. They are stories of upstarts. There are rags to riches stories. Typically, a poor boy from the countryside becomes the apprentice of a master. In the case of Jacob Newbury, this is a weaver. In the case of The Gentle Craft, this is a shoemaker. And they prove to be hardworking. They learn the trade. Eventually, the master dies, and they end up marrying either the daughter, or if there is no such thing, the widow of their former master, and in this way they become wealthy, they become their own men. This is the kind of narrative that was to knock down, that was to replace the romance. No more knights, no more kings, no more dukes and earls, but regular people who win their position due to their hard work. Self-made man. This is the new narrative. We'll move now to other types of literary elements, to nonfiction. There are several evolutions in nonfiction writing that were to be very important. One, the rise of the autobiography and memoir. As we have said earlier, the Protestant ethic encouraged people to writing their memoirs. Of course, we are mostly interested in the memoirs of famous people, and we have quite a number of celebrities of the time who wrote down their life stories. Then you have the rise of the biography of famous people, biographies of important people of the church, biographies of writers, biographies of politicians. We even have the case of people like Margaret Cavendish, who wrote the biography of her famous husband. Diaries. Diary writing became a fad, became very fashionable. We don't know exactly how many people kept a diary. As we will see a bit later, we have a few diarists who kept a very faithful track of everything that was going on in their lives, and their work is now of extraordinary importance because it gives us a good insight into the intimacy and privacy of lives against the background of historical change. The widespread practice of letter writing. This is related to evolutions in the postal system. Letter writing is also connected with more literacy, more people being able to read and write. And as we will see in a short time, in 1740, we have the first novel inspired by this practice, the first epistolary novel, and The interesting thing is that the heroine writing letters is not somebody rich, is not a wealthy person, she's just a chambermaid. Travelogues. Travel literature had become incredibly popular in the years preceding the birth of the novel, and actually Robinson Crusoe itself might have been inspired by such a travelogue, such a writing about one's voyages. Again, this will be the subject of another chat we're gonna have. The rise of the press in various forms, corantos, newsletters, newspapers, magazines. The press seems to be an English invention. Addison and Steele, the inventors of the British press, brought news, novelties, brought the new air of real life in their periodicals. And these two were to provide a much needed contact with reality that the novel needed. So as we can see, all of these fictional and non-fictional sources, in various ways, they contributed to the shaping of this dominant genre, the novel. In the next classes, some of these genres might appear to be more closely related to some novels. For instance, the practice of letter writing influenced the apparition of the epistolary novel. The travelogues anticipated novels like Robinson Crusoe, or the essay writing anticipated the sophisticated intellectual narrative of Laurence Sterne. So therefore, in our presentation of some of these novelists, we will take a quick look at some of these predecessors. To sum up, the period we're dealing with is mainly the 18th century. This is a timeline of the 18th century. On top of it, you have historical moments such as the South Sea Bubble, the Jacobite Rebellion, the union with Ireland. And beneath, we will have a look at some of the literary moments. First of all, at the very bottom, you have the main ages, the Augustan age. Pretty much all of this period is considered to be the Augustan age. And just towards the end of this period, at about 1797, you have the apparition of the Romantics. And then you have this, the early novel, which occurred in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Then we have the Age of Sensibility that brought to life the sentimental novel with Pamela by Samuel Richardson. And then, somewhere here, in the 1770s, 1780s, the Gothic novel, the horror or terror novel. Let's have a look at some of the landmark books. In blue, we'll have poets. In white, novels. Alexander Pope, The Rape of the Lock, famous mock heroic poem. And then 1719, Defoe, Robinson Crusoe, marking, as you know, the birth of the novel worldwide. Then Swift, Gulliver's Travels, just 7 years later, in 1726. Pamela, by Samuel Richardson, published in 1740, marks the birth of the epistolary novel and, at the same time, of the sentimental novel. Tom Jones, by Henry Fielding, of 1749, is both a continuator of the picaresque tradition, but also creator of a new type of novel with parallel plots, with a lot of suspense, with a lot of movement, and with a content that was meant to please both female and male readers. Between 59 and 66, Laurence Sterne published The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, one of the strangest productions of this period, a novel that many people claim to look more like a 20th century postmodern novel rather than an Augustan novel because of its playfulness and its use of many graphic elements like those exemplified here. 1764, one of the landmarks of the Gothic genre, Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, followed at some distance, 1794, by Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, so therefore another Gothic novel. The publication in 1750 of Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard anticipates Romanticism, and it's regarded as being the beginning of the pre-Romantic movement. Also anticipating Romanticism would be William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience in 1789, And the author that marks the end of this long 18th century is Jane Austen, with novels like Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility, a novelist that is no longer Augustan, neither Romantic nor Victorian. And that would be it.